An unprecedented third term for Xi Jinping, the first Chinese leader after party founder Mao Zedong to continue in power even after 2 5-year tenures. And that puts him on course to continue in power for life like Mao. His dominance and supremacy was visible and emphasized at the 20th Party Congress, where he received a rapturous applause for his wide-ranging speech, one in which he prioritized security, safety and national rejuvenation, and swore by Marxism, making a vow to make China a modern socialist country. What does it indicate about the future approach of Xi Jinping? What does a more dominant and stronger president mean for China? Also, should his rhetoric worry the world? That's the global debate. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tina Jha. A brilliant panel of distinguished experts is joining us today from different parts of the world. Pleased to welcome Mr. Yukong Huang. He's a senior fellow, Carnegie Asia Program, Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. Dr. Liu Roja, Associate Professor, International Studies, Flame University, Pune, Maharashtra. Professor Madhav Nalapat, he is a UNESCO Peace Chair, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, Manipal Academy of Higher Education. And Professor Robert S. Ross, he joins us from Boston College and Associate. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the program today to discuss the rise of Xi Jinping, what it means for China and the world. Professor Ross, you've been writing quite frequently on this subject in recent weeks, so let me begin the program today with you. Before we get into the future of what it means, let's go back a little into history and try and understand how Xi Jinping emerged from being a little-known personality a decade ago to today becoming the 21st century Mao.
Well, yes, we see with Xi Jinping a strong leader who, as you suggest, is the strongest Chinese leader since Mao Zedong. And every time we think that Xi Jinping may be facing a challenge, in reality he never does, and he just keeps getting stronger. And of course, as you suggested today, he's about to assume his third term in office, unprecedented since Chairman Mao, and he seems stronger than ever. He did this by not relying on his predecessors to put him into power, but by building his own power base. And in so doing, he also eliminated any other challenges that might exist from either the provinces or at the center. So in foreign policy, and we say China and the world, he is a one-man decision maker in many ways. He has minimal need to consult with others, whether it's the foreign ministry or other or military leaders. He will get briefed by them, but he makes his own decisions, reflecting his supreme authority today, his confidence in Chinese politics.
Is China moving from one party now to one man?
That would be rather strong. The provinces still matter, and policy making at the provincial level, the county level, there's still a considerable degree of autonomy in how policy is carried out. But I think we would be mistaken to say this is a one-man dictatorship. There are various forces in China that need to be taken into account, both in economic policy and in politics. But when he comes down to it, he will listen to these forces. He has to pay attention to these political forces, but ultimately he can make his own decision.
Okay, what kind of impact it's going to have on relations with other countries is something that I'll come back to you, Professor. Let me go across to Mr. Huang. If I'm audible to you, sir, this question is for you. Your perspective on the rise of Xi Jinping. He's set to get the third term now, the strongest leader after Mao Zedong. What does it mean for China?
Well, I think Xi laid out a vision for China, creation of a more modern, prosperous socialist economy, more powerful economy. But I think the key word is more innovative, technologically advanced. So if you look at his report to the 20th Party Congress, it's a continuation of past policies, but there are sort of some subtle differences. The concept of security in its many aspects shows up much more than in the past. What do we mean by security? Political security in terms of dealing with the West, particularly the United States. Technological security in terms of building self-sufficiency in the internal economy. Health security, zero COVID policies. Food security, these are becoming dominant themes. But the key issue for him to realize his objectives is whether he can keep China growing at a fairly reasonable, rapid pace. If you look 2 years ago, in 2020, during the pandemic, China was the only major economy that recorded positive growth of 2%. Last year grew by 8.5%, but this year is experiencing a major growth slowdown. The original target was 5.5%, but most people feel that it's likely going to be closer to 3% because the export markets are slowing down, local governments are running out of cash, zero COVID policies are affecting services, and you have a major property problem. So I think a key challenge for Xi Jinping in the coming years is can he get China up to growing, let's say, around 5 or 6% on a sustainable basis? And we don't have many indications from his report to the Party Congress on how he will achieve this.
Professor Nalapat, the fact that, there are domestic challenges, but in his address, the Chinese president did refer to security more often than economy. Perhaps security, safety, and national rejuvenation have taken center stage this time. How do you indicate, how do you read that? What does it indicate, particularly for countries with which China is engaged in some sort of a border dispute? So him continuing in power, what does that mean for all of these countries? Professor Nalapat.
Well, look, I'd like to say that the Communist Party system, the traditional Communist Party system in which Xi Jinping frankly represents, it's very difficult to remove a General Secretary. The General Secretary is basically the fulcrum of the entire system. And barring, for example, Nikita Khrushchev, who was removed a year and a half or so after he blinked in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, Mao Zedong certainly did not give China growth. In fact, Chinese economy was way smaller than the Indian economy at that point in time. Many tens of millions of Chinese lost their lives, some through deliberate state action or inaction, and others because of famine, caused again by state policy. Well, he continued and continued and continued. Stalin, I don't think Joseph Stalin was known for human rights or anything very much like that, but he continued and continued and continued. In the Soviet Union, you had Leonid Brezhnev. He continued. So it's very difficult to basically remove a General Secretary, which is why I was always a bit surprised at all these reports that have been appearing over the years. Oh, Xi Jinping is getting weaker, he's being challenged. As has correctly been said by one of the discussants, Xi Jinping has very clearly, in that he reminds me of Stalin actually, more than Mao. Mao was a little more, hit and miss. Xi Jinping was like Stalin, very organized. He took care of yesterday's enemies. Those who were powerful yesterday may not be powerful now, but he remembered them. Taught them a lesson. Today's enemies, the enemies of the day, and those he thought would be against him if things go bad for China. So he took care of all three of these categories, with the result that it's no surprise that all that's happening in the voting for the new presidium, for the new central committee, well, if there are one or two votes that are cast negatively, in my view, those votes will be cast because of the instructions of the Office of General Secretary. Like in the case of Stalin, the Office of General Secretary has become all-powerful in China. And in that sense, you can say it is one office rule. And Xi Jinping is really very much of a micromanager. Almost every aspect of major policy is not only being directed by him, but he wants to have control as well, which is why Chinese tech companies, the so-called private sector, not to mention state-owned enterprises, the Office of General Secretary wants a direct role in them. Previously, it was the Communist Party units. They, installed their people in these enterprises. Now, you have to get clearance from that office before in any major enterprise, anybody from the party is installed, and that person has the last word. So frankly, the degree of control we are seeing here is unprecedented.
So now going forth, Professor Nalapat, going forth, now, you say that 2 terms, Xi Jinping has moved very strategically, taking care of yesterday's enemies, making sure that there is no dissent against him. Dr. Roger, going into the 3rd term, what kind of change do you see in Xi Jinping's approach now that he is much more dominant? He is in a much more, strengthened position now.
Well, Tina, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to and honored to be on the same panel with the other panelists. I would like to say that I think there's an interesting indicator that we have to look for the following days that we will see, which is the combination of the PBSC or Politburo's Standing Committee. So now the guesses and speculations about what it's going to be. Wall Street Journal actually recently they have a list that Xi Jinping's people actually occupied and being dominant all of the PBSC, whilst there are some other sources that make different predictions, saying that there will be a balance of power between Xi Jinping and the Tuanpai or the Communist Youth League faction. So this is something that we will see, I mean, for the following days to come, that whether Xi Jinping has successfully, at the helms, or he can actually dominate the top echelon of the party, or he had to make some conciliations, or with the other factions within the party. If we see that Xi Jinping's people actually, all the president's men or all the Secretary General Xi's men was prevailing all the PBSC, that we will see a more pessimistic future. Especially for the neighboring countries around China, and especially for some places like Taiwan or Hong Kong, because that will mean that Xi Jinping has the predominance of power over the party. And if he is going to make a decision to attack Taiwan or to challenge India at the LAC or the line of actual control, that will be easier because he will be doing that without fewer limit of his power. So I think what will happen in the future, generally speaking, the tendency or the general tendency is that Xi Jinping will have more power than his predecessors, just like Professor Ross has rightly indicated that he has been rising up to power by building up his power base for the past few years. So just like I would like to echo what Professor Nalapa has said, that Xi Jinping's power now is unprecedented. After Mao, and he is more structural, he is more methodic, he knows how to make things done, but now he is facing some tests from the inside and from the outside. Domestically, whether the Chinese Communist Party under him can still strengthen the control over the society, that's the first challenge, especially after several days or several months and weeks of the zero COVID dynamic policy. That's the first thing. The second thing, the challenge is from the economic situation. Whether if China cannot keep up the high economic growth rate, what will happen in the next is another challenge for Xi. And the third thing is in the foreign policy, when facing the United States, coming back to East Asia and Indo-Pacific, how will China respond, and how successfully China will respond to that? I think that will be another challenge that Xi Jinping will be facing. But what we can see for now is that we will have a more assertive China to come.
Professor Ross, what does a more assertive China mean for the United States? Under his presidency, we've seen massive turbulence in US-China relations. Going forth, now, of course, we are discussing how Xi Jinping is in a much more dominant position. How do you look at the US-China relations going forth from here?
I think it's fair to say that the challenge that China presents is simply its growing capabilities in economic and military power. And for the most part, it's been fairly restrained in how it uses that power. It has tried to promote a rather cooperative image to the world, wanting to expand cooperation with European countries, with East Asian countries. And I think most observers would agree that in response to simply the rise of Chinese power, the challenge it poses to American dominance in technology, the international economy, the American dominance in military, the United States has increasingly adopted a containment policy. We certainly see that recently in our technology policies and the U.S. resistance to negotiating or diminishing the tariffs on China. And so the problem for Xi Jinping is he's been quite successful, one has to say, in having greater Chinese security within East Asian waters than any time in probably 200 years of Chinese history. And of course, China's emerged as a leader in Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, as an aid giver, as building construction, as a place to go to if you need assistance for economic development. So he's accomplished a lot. The challenge for Xi Jinping is that simultaneously, no pain, no gain. He now has a trade war with the United States. He now has a technology war with the United States, and relations with Europe are becoming more difficult. The challenge for Xi going forward is to continue to promote Chinese security in Asia and elsewhere, to try and work with Europe, while simultaneously managing a difficult domestic economy, as Dr. Huang has suggested, and try and manage the U.S. containment policy to limit its effect on Chinese development and on China's relationship with other advanced industrial economies, that be Japan, South Korea, Europe. The jury's out. I think he still intends to try and promote an image of cooperation, but whether the U.S. can offset that and impose costs that will offset any Chinese gains, that's Xi Jinping's biggest challenge.
Professor Nalapart, coming to the Indian context, and perhaps because we are next door neighbors, we have a border dispute, the Ladakh standoff, there's been no resolution in sight since, after so many rounds of talks as well. But what should India's approach be now in dealing with a more aggressive China, with Xi Jinping set to be at the helm for the third time? The fact that, some of the analysts are also pointing out that India's success in foreign policy will be determined by the kind of approach it has towards China. What's your opinion?
Well, Tina, I'm happy to see that our friends from the United States have such a optimistic and benign view of China. We are living next door to China. And it's remarkable, for example, how often the word fight, and Roger will confirm that what the interpretation given about struggle in the official translation is actually fight. He kept on repeating fight, 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 so very often in that speech. And he is giving this picture to the Chinese people that you've got very powerful enemy. And that powerful enemy is the United States. It's out to strangle you. And only I, a strong man with courage, with guts, and with the determination to take on this enemy, can defeat this enemy. That's the first point. And the second point is, I'm so happy that, in East Asia and other parts of the world, he's been so friendly. I haven't really noticed that in India. I haven't noticed that in Vietnam. I haven't noticed that friendly face of Xi Jinping in Taiwan. I haven't noticed that in the Philippines. He's grabbed sea space and land space from all these countries, and about nearly 80% of South China Sea, he's dotted with these artificial islands and taken control of them. So personally, I'm so happy to hear that he's a very nice chap. He's a friendly guy. He's just aggressive to keep his popularity going. We all know politicians, say all kinds of things to be popular, but the problem is Xi Jinping needs only to be popular with a handful of people, and one of them will be, of course, the military people. Then in my view, Roger, I have no doubt that the standing committee is going to be filled with individuals who are basically completely dipped in Xi Jinping thought. At one time it was Mao Zedong thought, now it is Xi Jinping thought. I am reasonably confident of that. I've been confident of that. I've been tracking Xi's slow strangulation of his enemies right from 2012, the anti-corruption campaign, the anti-party campaign, the fighting the enemies of the West campaign, all these great campaigns to make China a secure nation. Well, is it secure? I don't know. I'm going to defer to, my colleagues here. But I'd only like to make one point. You see what's happening to young Iranians, especially Iranian women. Young Chinese, I can tell you, they want economic growth. And frankly, many of them have traveled to the US, they've traveled to the West, and they really don't recognize this ferocious, implacable enemy that is being painted by the Communist Party of China today of these countries. India, I think we have to really keep our guard up, quite frankly. But the good news is, the more China under Xi Jinping is seen to be what, in my view, it most likely is, an aggressive, expansionist power, the better will be the reception given to India.
Dr. Rogers, since, we are going to see more of an expansionist Xi Jinping, as Professor Nalapat says, how dangerous is it for Taiwan?
This is a very tricky issue here because I just returned from Taiwan. Well, there are two different guesses among the policymakers and scholars in Taiwan. One still holds the idea that Xi Jinping is still very passive in the Taiwan issue. He wants to stop Taiwan from going into de facto independence. That's his first priority. But another, faction or the strength of scholars, they firmly believe that from the year 2024 to the year 2027, there will be a dangerous window being opened. And Xi Jinping will use these 3 years to prepare more militarily to attack Taiwan, and Taiwan should be fully prepared. So well, to be honest, I don't know which one stands true because now we are not still there yet. But what can be sure is that the PLA has been preparing themselves militarily to, step up the capabilities to conquer Taiwan, or at least to demonstrate a credible military force to force Taiwan to accept reunification options once it is necessary, that Xi Jinping, if he gives the order. So I think for the following years to come, we will see a more tense situation being raised up, and the relationship between China and the United States will be worsened. This is something that we can be sure.
Okay, so while this is something that you predict, let me go across to Mr. Huang and talk about the domestic challenges as well, because on the foreign policy, there might be a different approach, but on the domestic front, the kind of economic challenge that Xi Jinping is yet to see. Although one thing, Mr. Huang, that we see in Xi Jinping's case is that he is quite persistent with the policies despite opposition.
Well, Xi has a vision of China, what I call a more prosperous, innovative, technologically self-sufficient economy. And his goal is not next year or next 5 years, it's 2035. So we make a mistake if we think about this year and even this 5-year term. By 2035, he will be the same age as President Biden is today. So think about what he has in mind for 2035. I think his vision of China is not the vision of what I would call the United States. He doesn't see a China as dominated by, let's say, Wall Street financiers or Silicon Valley digital giants. He has a focus on quantum technology, AI, advanced materials, electronic vehicles, pharmaceuticals, medical supplies. So it's a different kind of vision, and it's different from what we've seen before. And the question is, can he shape that? And he's shaping that by reallocating resources from what I call the traditional profit centers. And that's why he's cut back on Alibaba and Tencent and other kinds of giants which have been absorbing a lot of the money. He wants the money to flow into different areas. We've never seen a country try to do this. So we don't know whether it's going to be successful. So that's a big issue. But he cannot succeed unless he can get growth rates up closer to 5 to 6%.
Yes.
This year it's going to be closer to 3. So that's a big issue. And then the question is, can China grow, let's say at 5 or 6% steadily for another decade and a half? And the answer is it can. It's a highly distorted economy, but it has very major growth potential. Let me just give you a few illustrations of this. For the last 10 years, China has been investing most of its money in the interior for its distribution poverty's sake. But the higher returns are along the coastal areas and central provinces. So if China spread its public investment more evenly, growth would probably increase by 1 full percentage point. China has a very strict residency policies. You cannot move to Shanghai or Beijing, the big cities, but you can move to the smaller cities. And it's the only country in the world that controls the movement of people in this way. As a consequence, cities like Shanghai and Beijing, although there are 20 million people, are actually too small. And China's small cities are actually too large. It's the only country in the world that has this particular pattern. The density of people, for example, in Beijing and Shanghai is lower today than it was 10 years ago. There are fewer people in the central portions of these cities than in the outer areas. If you let Chinese live where they want to be, you could increase growth by perhaps another 1%. So there are all sorts of things that Xi could do, but he has not done because of the political sensitivities. And if he did this, he could grow 5 to 6%. So the big question economically is a more politically confident Xi Jinping willing and able to move forward on reforms which before the country was not willing to do? And that's the big challenge. Let me stop there.
Absolutely. Professor Nalapal, that's an interesting question, and that is going to determine China's position in the global order as well in the times to come. Do you think so?
Tina, I'd like to say that India is in the same position as China was in the 1980s, in the sense that people were looking at moving and a large platform, a huge population, lots of workers, lots of talent, and frankly, decoupling is a fact. I'm sure that our friends here know that so far as AI is concerned, technology is concerned, it is not only just dual use, but in the case of China, mainly military use. We are seeing in India, whether it's in the underwater domain, whether it is in the sea surface, whether it's in the air surface, space surface, land surface, Xi Jinping has been paying particular attention to developing his military powers. Now, maybe that particular school of thought which Roger is talking about is right, and he's only doing that because he likes to play as soldiers. Maybe he likes to play as a teenager, as a soldiers. But it could also be that the man is deadly serious about what he says he wants to do, which is basically, extinguish any challenge to what he says is sovereignty of China. And this sovereignty is based on all kinds of maps, which frankly have come from thin air, absolutely thin air. So I'd like to say, one, the question of this decoupling, it's a fact. Two, the fact is there's already tremendous overcapacity in Chinese manufacturing. Chinese technology, well, Alibaba, Tencent, they were growing very fast. I don't think that's going to be a worry for their competitors now, after Xi Jinping has been through with them. And the most important thing is market. People, the populations across the world. I know in India, I am very certain the United States may not be in the academic community, but there is a very strong feeling against China. It's the same thing in Taiwan. I am amazed to see the negativity about China in Taiwan. So the reality is people are withdrawing from reliance on China. And this decoupling is going on and accelerating. Vietnam is benefiting. Indonesia is benefiting. A lot of Taiwanese companies are now coming back because they know in 3 or 4 years, if you're a Taiwanese company and you operate in China, Xi Jinping will make you do things that will get you arrested as soon as you land in Taipei.
Okay,
or
Professor
anywhere
Ross.
else, Washington.
Professor Ross, you seem to be
wherever.
smiling. Let me get your perspective on what Professor Nalapal is saying. The fact that countries are withdrawing, is it so?
The image of the Chinese threat to Taiwan is interesting because over the last 15 years, nothing's really changed in Chinese capabilities. China's had a missile ability to take out Taiwan's infrastructure and leadership for the last 15 years. It's dominated the airspace over Taiwan for the last 15 years. It's dominated the naval waters going out 300 miles for the last 10 years. So that the image of this growing threat to China because of its growing capabilities is somewhat misplaced, particularly when the Defense Department, the CIA, the State Department, Taiwan's military all say that the mainland does not have the capability to occupy Taiwan. And they all say that the mainland doesn't have an amphibious force to occupy Taiwan. So what's happening here, this all reflects American concern that American leadership is eroding around the world. And America is trying to organize the world to maintain its leadership and to reduce China's challenge. And so we've actually changed our Taiwan policy. Since 2018, it wasn't until about late 2020 that China became more assertive in using its military around Taiwan. We're trying to organize the world to support American sweeping technology controls on China and Europe and Japan and South Korea don't want to.
That having been said, I'll have to wind up the program. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on this edition of the Global Debate, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. So that's it from us on this edition of the Global Debate today, viewers. Thank you for your time as well.